Prior to the early 1100s, the Mongols didn't really exist as an ethnic group. There are some records from the Tang dynasty which possibly mention a group which became the Mongols. The name they record can certainly be read in that manner, but they don't show up officially until the 12th century, and even then it's kind of obscure. Their rise to prominence is a fairly well-known story, so we won't dwell on it aside from using it to set the stage for the main topic of this video. In 1167, the leader of the Mongols was poisoned by another steppe tribe, the Tatars, while having dinner with them. Leaderless, the tribe broke up, and the murdered chieftain's son, Temujin, fled with his mother and his half-brother. Temujin eventually rose to become the leader of the Mongols in his father's footsteps. Through a combination of war and diplomacy, Temujin, who had taken the title Genghis Khan, meaning Boundless Khan, had united many other steppe tribes under his rule, with his army eventually numbering something like 95,000 men. And in 1206, he was declared Khagan, Supreme or Great Khan, over all who lived on the steppe. After solidifying his control over the steppe, he unleashed the Mongols on the Jin dynasty in 1210. His conquests continued over the course of his life, and when Genghis died in 1227, his successors continued the wars against the Chinese dynasties, although they pulled back from the more Western engagements against countries in Europe. And in 1234, the Jin dynasty was destroyed. Engaging the Southern Song dynasty to the south of the Yangtze River, however, meant employing Chinese technology, naval craft, sailors, and engineers, and by 1279, the Southern Song had indeed been destroyed. They were conquered, their military power broken, and their last emperor drowned. Stretching from Hungary and Poland in the west at its greatest extent, across the steppe to Manchuria and north to Korea in the east, and south to what is roughly northern India, and to an extent a bit of Southeast Asia, the Mongol Empire was the largest continuous land empire ever created, but it quickly broke apart into smaller realms. In the east, centered on Beijing, Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai, established a semi-Chinese style dynasty known as the Yuan dynasty. Everyone knows, of course, that the Mongols invaded Japan, or attempted to invade Japan, but why did they do this? In 1268, Kublai began to focus on Japan, but if you recall what I said a moment ago, in the late 1260s, the Mongols had not yet finished subduing the Song dynasty. So why did he choose to do this, rather than focus all his efforts at completing the current war, as would make sense logically? Well, we don't really know. It's been proposed that because Kublai was educated in the Chinese tradition, so a cut-down explanation of that is lots of history, Confucianism, understanding the purpose and the role of leaders and of hierarchy in a society, etc., he demanded Japanese subjugation, as earlier dynasties and emperors of China had done. Now, he sent a couple letters to the Japanese, and the first letter is, well, I was going to say nice. It's not nice. It's a cordial letter, and it definitely plays on that idea of submission, utilizing the language of a father-son relationship, but it's backed beneath the surface by force. So this shows up in Japan, specifically Kyushu, in 1266, and another one in 1267, accompanied by Korean ambassadors, and the Japanese were not entirely sure what to make of this. The imperial court suggested that some sort of agreement be reached, but the Hojo, the regents who controlled the shogunate, weren't having it. So they had anyone who owned territory in the western regions of Japan, Kyushu and southern Honshu, return to their territory, and they ordered the Chinje Bugyo, the defense commissioner of the west, to fortify areas where the Mongols would possibly invade. So that perhaps begged the question, why did the shogunate have a position with that title? Well, if you recall what we went over in the previous video, after the Jokyo War, the Jito and Shugo who worked for the shogunate obtained new territories to govern in the more western reaches of the Japanese islands. And that's essentially how the power structures of the Kamakura shogunate and of the Minamoto and Hojo clans before the shogunate was even established had worked. I'm oversimplifying this for the purposes of this video because it's sort of a tangential topic, but the power bases for the Kamakura Bakufu were centralized in the east. And although the shogunate held some territory in the west, this was the domain of two rivals. The first rivals were the Taira, and although they were the main opponents of the Minamoto during the Genpei War, which ended in their defeat and the creation of the shogunate in the first place, the Taira were not fully destroyed, and the first shogun was under the impression that his brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, wanted power, so he sent men to kill his brother, and Yoshitsune had fled to the west. Now, he eventually took his own life, but from the perspective of the shogunate, the western portion of Japan were areas where shogunal control could possibly be contested, so the point of the office of the Chinji Bugyo was to keep an eye on things and respond to any sort of rebellion. So, in 1274, the Mongols, along with Korean soldiers and Korean and Chinese sailors, attempted to invade Japan. The grand total was something like 28,000 soldiers and sailors, opposed by something like 5,000 or 6,000 Japanese, maybe a little more. Now, I've used the phrase something like and the word maybe because we don't actually know. The official histories of the Yuan dynasty and some Japanese records heavily inflate the numbers to make this look like a battle between hundreds of thousands, but we know that that wasn't that high. Based on battle reports on the Japanese side, the number of ships employed, etc., historians have argued for much, much lower numbers, to the effect that the Japanese and the Mongol forces essentially had parity with one another. The Mongol fleet set sail from Korea from the port city of Happo, modern-day Masan, on the 2nd of November, 1274. Mongol forces first took the island of Tsushima and Iki, and then, on the 19th of November, the principal Mongol forces landed at Hakata Bay in Kyushu. Legend and popular memory hold that Japan was saved by the gods, who unleashed a kamikaze, a divine wind, which came in the form of a typhoon and which sank the Mongol fleet. This idea has been effectively put to rest by a historian named Thomas Conlon in his book In Little Need of Divine Intervention, where he takes a fresh look at the evidence and argues that, actually, the invading and defending forces both numbered something like 3,000 or 4,000, and the Chinese sources for the first invasion don't mention any sort of typhoon. The Korean and Japanese sources mention some rain and some strong wind, but November isn't typhoon season, so while it's entirely possible that there was strong weather, whatever it was not a typhoon. It's not certain why the Mongols turned back. It's entirely possible they felt they were defeated, and it's also entirely possible that they felt that the burning and destruction they caused was enough to send a message. But whatever the reasons, the Mongol army turned back. Now, in 1281, the Mongols returned to Japan, this time with a larger force, and this time it's quite possible that the numbers were significantly larger, although not the 100,000 soldiers and sailors recorded. But because the Mongols assembled over 4,000 ships for the campaign, estimates vary between 40 and 70,000 troops in total depending on who you read, and they set sail in late May, and they first attacked the islands of Tsushima and Iki like they had done the first time. However, the Japanese weren't standing idly by. Realizing that an invasion was likely to take place on Kyushu, especially at Hakata Bay, because it was one of the closest points to the mainland, the Japanese constructed the Genko Burui, a 12-mile long, 6.5 feet high, 6.5 feet wide wall along the bay, although this was originally called the Ishitsuji. This was paid for in the form of a tax, 1 stone per koku of rice. So another way of putting that is that for every amount of rice grown which could support a samurai for a year, which is what a koku measurement is, 1 construction stone had to be paid by temples and communities in the region. When the Mongols finally came, the fortification was not entirely completed, but enough of the wall was built, complete with defensive stakes along the beaches and shields and other defenses atop the wall, that the Mongols ran into problems. It also doesn't help that the Mongol fleet had been split in two owing to its size, with the plan being that one portion would set off from Korea and the other would set off from China. They would link up and they would use their joint forces to invade. Well, the Korean fleet got there a week ahead of schedule and attempted to land, and half of the army attacked southern Honshu in modern-day Nagato province, where they were defeated and driven back, and the other half attempted to actually land at the fortified beach. But the wall, as it was designed to do, prevented them from effectively doing this. So, the Korean fleet dropped anchor off Shikonoshima Island, just off the coast of Hakata Bay, and the Japanese counterattacked, launching daytime raids on the fleet, as well as attacking the Mongols at Iki Island, forcing the Mongols to retreat further to Hirado Island, by which time the fleet from China showed up. Now the two fleets attempted to invade Hakata, but they were beaten to a stalemate over about 2 weeks. It's at this point, on August 15th, which is right in the middle of typhoon season, that all of the sources, the Mongol, the Korean, the Chinese, and the Japanese, record a typhoon sweeping through and destroying the Mongol fleet. And as it happens, marine archaeology has actually uncovered some remains of this fleet, and there is indeed storm damage. And, although a third invasion was planned, Kublai Khan's advisors strongly suggested that this be called off, calling attention to the expense and the casualties already sustained, and, probably because of this, there was no third invasion. Japan had been saved. But, now the Kamakura shogunate had a very serious problem. Samurai and other Japanese warriors at the time, and even into the next century, would submit battle reports and petitions for reward. Essentially, these were documents saying that I am so-and-so and I did this, that, and the other thing while on the field. Here are the number of heads I have taken, and so is my witness. A lot of these survived from earlier conflicts like the Genpei and the Jokyo Wars, and part of the reward was land. Sometimes it was money, sometimes it was equipment, etc. The problem is that because this was a defensive war, there was no territory to dish out, and the shogunate gave quite a bit of money to Buddhist temples, whose monks had chanted sutras and prayers for victory, and not to the warriors who did the actual fighting. Now, some of them were rewarded, but the general lack of rewards and the general lack of booty started to discredit the shogunate in the eyes of many samurai and many warrior houses. At the same time, there was a rising money economy in Japan, and the samurai, who were living on stipends or fixed income from lands they held, began to fall into poverty. And just as an aside, this is not the last time this would happen. And they all start taking on debt to finance themselves, but they can't pay back that debt because they lack the income. It's why they're going into debt in the first place. So in 1297, the shogunate passed the Edict of Tokusei, the Edict of Grace, which canceled debt and required that samurai who had sold land have it returned to them to try and stabilize things. But all this does is create more legal problems, and it makes a system that was highly litigious even more litigious. Now, while this was happening, the power of the shugo, the provincial constables, was beginning to increase because land was being concentrated in their hands. Order gradually began to break down, and the last 30 years of Kamakura rule was largely characterized by increasing disorder and chaos, and we start seeing the appearance of akuto, literally the evil bands, gangs of uprooted peasants, and others who had resorted to banditry, and their prevalence was increased due to the disputes between the Honjo and the Shokan. So Honjo were the proprietors of estates, responsible for implementing the control of agriculture and the general running of things, and Shokan were heads of portions of estates which had been donated to temples or were otherwise exempted from tax. I've mentioned a few times now that the Kamakura shogunate is highly litigious, or was highly litigious, and subdivisions of power like this is a major reason why. It wasn't always clear who had authority where, and during the end of the Kamakura period, as the socioeconomic situation began to change, social mobility increased, and the conflicts that ensued led to disruptions and the use of small Akuto bands to wreak havoc on some estates. So, by 1320, what you have then is a situation where order is beginning to break down, the military government is not held to be legitimate by many warriors, and the time was ripe for rebellion, which is exactly what happens. So in the next video, which will be the last, we'll explore how the Muromachi shogunate came to be, and how its political and legal developments led to the creation of the famous Japanese daimyo.